Excuse me, everyone. So, hi, good afternoon. We'll be starting already with the lecture on Module 7. So, right now, wala pang Module 7 na actual PDF, so that will be sent to you tonight. There just needs to be some polishing that's needed to create. So, for today, instead, I'll just be going with the PowerPoint and I'll try to explain the majority of the things that will be part of your quiz, as well as the things that you might need to be able to be aware of. So as you can see, Module 7 is something that was not on your Module 0. So originally your Module 0 had effects animation. That was scrapped to a new topic for acting and performance in animation for a number of reasons. Number one, yung effects animation natin, even though it will still be part of your Module 7, is not necessarily practical, so to speak, particularly right now with what we have for our module 6, 8, 9, and 10. So yung effects animation natin is an entirely different ballpark which has a lot more nuances and a lot more complexities na medyo mahirap na if you try to learn it right now. So with that one, with that one, it's not really also very practical with what we're going to be talking about, which is in-betweening. Second of all is that effects animation right now is quite impractical in such a way that it's not really utilized right now as hand-drawn. So most of the time, ang ginagamit natin for effects animation really is 3D particle simulations because it's a lot more practical. It costs lesser time and it's much more accurate in terms of the physics of it. So with that one, usually when it comes to effects animation, you have to do it in 3D. However, learning the basics through traditional animation is nice to have. And the third one is that I believe that this lesson would be a lot more practical when it comes to your module 6 as well as your module 8, 9, and 10. In the interest of making it so that it's as smooth when it comes to the learnings, the transition of what you're going to learn. And at the same time, it's a lot more necessary whenever you're going to go with your modules 8 and 10, 8 to 10, which will focus more on lip syncing character monologue. So with that one, we'll be focusing on this one instead. So acting and performance in animation is technically part of module 6. Module 6 is in betweening or producing digital in betweening animation or digital in betweens. For that one, that's a little bit more technical. Whereas for module 7, this is quite abstract when it comes to how it is going to be used in terms of the animation. Abstract in such a way that this one really depends on your personal preference. This depends on the situation that you're going to utilize it for, and it really requires a lot of creativity and artistry that your module 6 doesn't really pertain too much. So that is where acting and performance comes in. It's more of the abstract aspect of your module 6. So for this one, these are mostly guidelines. I do understand that you don't have to utilize this all. You are not really required to utilize this all at the same time because that would be very much impractical and it defeats the purpose of it. So it's up to you. Hopefully by the end of this lesson, you would be able to kind of pick and choose the things that you might be needing when it comes to acting and performance in terms of animation. So after that very long prelogue, let me now get into another prelogue, which is the introduction. So essentially, the main goal of motion picture, regardless if it's live action or animation, is essentially immersion of the audience. So this immersion can come from a number of things. It can be, of course, entirely forgetting the world that you're living in and you really believe that you are part of the world that you're watching or experiencing right now. So that can either be through games, that can either be through motion pictures, as we've stated, movies, television shows, animations, and so on and so forth. Another thing that you can do with this one is to kind of make it so that your audience is enjoying it so much that they don't really recognize the passage of time. So when you're in the movie theaters, you just feel like 10 minutes is done and you've already finished like a 2-hour movie. O kaya naman when you're watching a 20-minute episode, you feel like just 5 minutes has passed and you've already finished the episode. So something like that. Another thing is that you can use immersion by relating your audience to the characters. So there are a lot of different things that you can do on how to immerse your audience in motion picture. That is regardless if you're doing live action or animation. The way that you're able to do it varies from genre to genre and even according to the medium that you're going to utilize. So animation has its own advantages and even disadvantages compared to that of live action. But the main difference that they have is that animation essentially has the ability to make it so that you can create it from the ground up. So what does this mean? Let's try and compare it with live action. So sa may live action natin, even though if you were to create an entirely different world o kaya naman build an entirely different set, you still have remnants of the reality or the real world. So for example, if you were to create an entirely new world, you'll be using CGI, and CGI is essentially animation. So first and foremost, if you really want an out of this world experience, you still need animation. Second of all is that if you were to create it from actual material, so for example, you want to recreate British Victorian era, you'll still have to utilize materials from the modern world and you will still be using actors from the modern world. So the actual immersion isn't necessarily there. And if ever gusto mong gumawa ng actual immersion, there is that risk wherein you're isolating other people. So like for example, if we're going to talk about the idea of dress. So the way that we dress right now has a certain appeal to us right now. So if we were to go back to the 90s, yes, it still has that appeal, but it kind of isolates a certain kind of audience. And if you go back to a lot more periods, which has a lot more avant-garde type of dress, you would be isolating a lot of your audiences. So that immersion is essentially cut. Live action as well has a lot of limitations, particularly physics. Physics exists in the real world and we are bound by it. For example, when you want to create a lot of action scenes, you need a lot of interventions. That would be stunt doubles, usage of very clever camera angles, wire work, and so on and so forth. If you want to be able to utilize, let's say, real life animals to be able to emote like humans, you can't really do that. So for example, yung live action, quote unquote, live action Lion King, the one that was just released very recently, you would see that there's a lot of lapses in terms of emotional aspect. Because yung mga facial expressions that we use for humans to make it so that we're happy, we're sad, and so on and so forth, is something that you can't really do for animals because the way that animals move their faces is entirely different. So if you would like to showcase your teeth if you're a human, that can give an idea of trust. Or if you want to smile and you want to show your teeth, that's okay. But if you want to have yet an animal smile and show their teeth, that is kind of creepy to some audiences. So in a way, if you're going to do it with live action, you tend to have certain type of limitations that animation doesn't necessarily have a problem. Animation, therefore, has the ability to kind of suspend disbelief, regardless of what's happening on the screen. Since you can do a lot of things with animation, you can essentially do, as we've stated, a lot of things. You can do out of this world scenarios. You can create a lot of situations that don't really happen in the real world, but it's very much possible in animation. One example that I've been currently stating is something which we call as anthropomorphism, which is, if you remember from your animation 11b, the idea of animals walking and acting like humans. So their facial expressions are created from the ground up so that it can mimic human emotion, so that you're able to create again that immersion. And it's fine. You don't really have to think, or you don't have to really worry about, oh, like this face twitch isn't really realistic because it's an animation. You're supposed to go around, you're supposed to get away with the fact that this isn't natural and I'm okay with it. And that's really the main beauty of it when it comes to suspending disbelief. Another one is, let's say, a lot of the comedy slapstick that comes from Western cartoons, like the falling piano, people going into construction sites, and a lot of hijinks happen, or even musicals. So people in the real world don't really break into song and dance, but you see that in a lot of production. So if you see that, it's kind of it doesn't really look convincing that normal people, real life people, would really go out of their day to join in this entire dance number. But if you were to do it in an animation, like it doesn't we don't really even have talking animals in real life. So what is stopping me from believing that every one of the characters in here can spring out to song and dance? So that's something that we can do when it comes to animation. You can do the silliest of things and it can still work. So with that one, that is actually one of, let's say, the advantages and at the same time disadvantages of animation. Because the more that you do that, you kind of stray away more when it comes to realism. And I think that is one of the main disadvantages of animation. You can do a lot of really weird things in there, but at the same time, if you want a more realistic type of approach, it's not really that believable. So for example, one example right here is the movement of subtlety or the idea of subtlety. Ibig sabihin, you just have very small movements on the face, small movements of the body. You can do that in live action. It will register from the camera to the audience. However, when it comes to animation, you can't do that. So like, let's say, a very simple face twitch is not really something that you can convey very easily in terms of animation. It can just be an animation error. You can just think, or as an audience member, you can just think like that. When in reality, you're creating a subtle approach. So in that regard, animation isn't really suited for that one. In that with that case, the way that we tackle acting and performance in animation it has a lot of similarities with live action, yet at the same time there's a lot of differences. One of the main difference for acting and performance in animation is that for live action, of course, you have the actor. It's all the actor. Whereas for acting and performance in an animation, it has a lot of factors. You have the voice actor, you have the storyboard artist, the way that the layout is created, and especially the animator. So as an animator, the way that we are able to do acting and we are essentially the main actors and the main performers. And our main goal really is to realize the intended spirit of the action, yet at the same time showcase the individuality and artistry of the animator. So this is where really the creativity comes in, how you attack that acting and performance. I've stated this before, but this is an example. If you remember yung module, yung module 4 and 5 natin, the keyframes that you use for that one, it's very much similar than what you've done for animation 12A. So you've had the same keyframes, you have the same special instructions, you have the same character, you have the same number of in-betweens. But the way that we do a head turn, which is the activity that we did beforehand, can differ from person to person. Because what we care about in an animation would differ from animator to animator. So for example, there would be one animator that would really focus on facial expression rather than body movement. O kaya naman there would be that one animator that would really focus more on body movement rather than the facial expression. There would be one person who would focus more on the gradual change of facial expression, and there would be that other person na mas gusto nilang isa-isahin yung aspects of the facial expression to move one by one. Even like, let's say, as keyframe animators, how we interpret a scene in the storyboard might be different from senior animator to senior animator. How we are able to express a certain emotion in an animation might differ from person to person. And with that one, that really comes into the individuality of an animator. And as animators, I hope you're able to, by the end of this, not only module, but also by the end of your animation NC2 journey, you're able to understand what matters to you as an animator. And there are a lot of different ways on how you can do that. For this lesson, we'll only be focusing on three. We have acting, composition, and flexibility. We have a lot more, like let's say anticipation, takes and accents, as well as stagger timings. Those will be part of your module 7 as well. However, they're quite something that is more towards the senior animator. That's why I didn't really include them right here. And also, it's something that you already know, so particularly anticipation. So for these three, I'll be focusing more onto both the abstract concept of acting and performance and the technical concept of acting and performance. So the first one we have here, acting, focuses mostly on how a character appears and acts on a screen. Eto, this focuses more on the character rather than the animation aspect. So that will be later on towards the composition character or the composition part. So we have a lot of ways on how we can do this. There are a lot more that I haven't really placed in this lesson and even in the module that would really refer to you. We have quite a number right here, understanding the character up until use of reference. So the one that is bold right here, I'll be explaining it on this slide, whereas the other ones right here have visual examples. So I will be using other slides for that one. So let's start off first with understanding the character. I'm not so sure if naituro sa inyo ito nung Animation 11A, but it's very important for you as animators to have an idea of character design. Not necessarily know how to design a character from the ground up, but to be able to understand the design of the character. So not just like how it physically looks, like the modeling and everything. You also have to understand like what the character is, what their personality is, what their psyche is, what are their attitudes based on situations, how do they look like when they are emoting, what are their beliefs, morals, goals in life. All of those things can help you create what a character is. And one of the most important parts in understanding a character is the situation. Situation can create an attitude. And attitude is very different from personality. Personality essentially means what you are normally as a person. So you can be normally extroverted or normally introverted, or you're just generally shy of people. But a situation can, but an attitude depends on the situation. So for example, if you have a normally introverted person, they are normal, you would hear this for a lot of people. They are shy when it comes to people that they don't know, but they act really wild when they are with their friends. O kaya naman you have this really well-mannered, kind character. But if you face them through one person, they would go crazy for that, or they would go crazy with every sense of the word for if they see that character. So those different situations would showcase different aspects of your character. So hindi naman na yung character ninyo would react to every single situations the same way that they would always do. So if they are in a happier situation, of course they would have one way on how they would react. If they are met with unfavorable situations, then you can kind of see the testament and the resiliency of the character. Another thing that we would like to focus on when we're understanding the character is the emotions that they project. So of course, the way that characters outwardly project their emotion differs from person to person. And that can be based on the body language, that can be based on the situation, but there is also quite a need for us to understand the true emotion of that character when they are emoting something. And this is where the second part comes in, the use of the eyes. So the eyes, as we have stated, is the windows to the soul. And the way on how we utilize eyes in animation is to showcase the emotion that the character is creating. So for example, even though that the character is physically smiling, but their eyes say otherwise, that is a very clear indication of the true feeling of that character. O kaya naman when they're truly smiling, you can also very much see it in their eyes. So if you want to be able to showcase, like let's say subtleties, that's probably one of the good things that you can do. Showcase the eyes for their true emotion, and then everything else, their body language, says otherwise. Lastly, for at least this slide, is the use of reference. Similar to normal actors, If an actor likes this method acting style of another actor, or if they like this quirk of another person, they would steal it and then utilize it as reference for the character that they're working on. Similar to that of animated characters. If you think that this normal person, like you like a certain aspect of their personality or how they react to a certain situation, or let's say the way that they have these certain types of quirks, you can utilize that for your character. But it is very important for you to understand that there is a difference between reference and at the same time copying. Reference takes something and then utilizes it as inspiration, making it so that the initial reference is somewhat fitted to the character, or it's somewhat different to the character, and it really fits them. Whereas for copying, you don't really understand how it works. You don't really understand how it is integrated to the character. You just utilize it. And if you just utilize it without really understanding it to the context of the character, it looks forced. It looks out of character. So using reference in terms of acting is more or less an inspiration rather than just straight up copying. We also have quite a number of things here. Body language up until twinning. So first one is body language. Essentially, even in live action, you don't really say what the character wants to say, or you don't really say the story. You show what the character feels. You show the story based on their body language, how they move, how they act, all of those different things. And the gestures of a character can really help showcase the personality of a character without even stating it. So with that one, even right now that we are doing a lot of animation, it's really important for you to showcase the movement of a character rather than just stating it, even if there is dialogue. And when it comes to body language, your gestures are something that you can utilize together with your dialogue. Ang common mistake natin dito is that you would do it at the same time. So in this example, one thing that you can do this in a less impactful way is for you to point and at the same time state what the character has to say. So it is much better for you to kind of isolate it into two different frames, even though that the action is very fast, but there is a very distinct difference. So you would have one frame point, like this one right here, and you would have another frame that would just do the statement. So even though that it's only a 1 frame, 2 frames difference, those will be noticeable. It's not necessarily na makikita siya, but it's something that you feel. And that's really the point of these subtleties on body language. The audience doesn't really have to outwardly see that there is a difference between the gestures and the statement, but they should feel it because there is a separation towards the gesture and the statement. So it makes it a lot more impactful. Whereas you're doing it at the same time, the audience doesn't really know where to focus. Do they focus on the statement? Do they focus on the gesture? So you can also do it in a different way, rather reversed. So pwedeng may statement muna, and then afterwards, the character points. So that is for body language. That same aspect can also be utilized for change of expression. We don't really do things gradually all at the same time. We tend to do it one at a time. What I mean by this one is that you create certain steps so that it is slightly unnoticeable, but yet you feel it. So one example is we have this one right here. From this point, this first keyframe, up until the end right here, you can see somewhat 3 changes to the expression. The first one is this furrowed eyebrow right here. The second one is this eyebrow that's going up right here. And then the third one is yung sa may mata natin that's moving towards the other side. So if we were to do this normally, which is technically correct, you can gradually move both of the eyebrows and the eyes for you to get to this destination. That is correct. It's nothing really wrong if you do something like that. But at the same time, it can be a lot better if you try to do it one at a time. So as you can see in this illustration, bababa muna yung eyebrows, which would create this furrowed eyebrow kind of look, which satisfies our first idea. And then you have this one right here, yung nakataas na eyebrow natin, which satisfies our next idea. And then the third one is you have the eyes moving to one side. So with this one, if you think about it, sabihin natin this is like 8 frames. So 2 frames exposure each. So with this one, you would see that there is really not a lot of difference. It's just a 2 frame difference. However, that 2 frame difference is something, again, that you can feel as an audience member, but not necessarily see. And a lot of the times, the way that the audience member feels is a lot more impactful than the visual aspect. Because if you just see the visual aspect, you might forget it because it's a visual experience. You might see a lot more visually stunning things. But if you permeate through the audience through feeling, that is a lot more impactful rather than something that is merely just visual. Next one is the contrast. So for our contrast, we're looking into the movement of the characters. So we have this one right here, our starting frame, and then we have our next frame. What would happen usually is that this initial frame right here has the character sitting up. So that would mean that the head is farther away from the book. That is fine, and you would still get somewhat of a change on expression. However, if you have the head a little bit lower, then you can get a grander change of facial expression. So not only would your usually kasi what would happen is that the path of action, if you just have the normal sitting up posture, is just a very slight U shape. Whereas for this one, you can very much see a grander change in, like, let's say, the movement or the path of action. You can also create really good silhouettes when it comes to this. So the silhouette of this one, you can see that the character is somewhat crunched up to a position. So you can very much see that probably they're in a state of comfort. Whereas this one, you can very much see the silhouette or at least the change of silhouette. Next one is twinning. I think this is the last part for acting. Twinning is essentially the idea of using both parts of your body to mirror them. So also known as symmetry or mirroring. So twinning isn't necessarily good generally in the industry. So if you talk to a lot of animators or directors, they don't really like the idea of twinning. There might be a reason for that. One is because you see a lot of novice animators utilize it so that it's easier for them to be able to animate. But that's not really the point of twinning. The point of twinning is for you to emphasize a certain action. So if you do it a lot of the times, it kind of loses its value. So when it comes to twinning, you only use it in the most crucial of ways. If you really want to emphasize something, the character to emphasize something, you can use this. If you would like to use twinning a lot more than expected, then it would be much better for you to have other ways on how to showcase it. Like, for example, delaying parts of it. So we have this one hand right here being placed in a much more delayed position than this one. It's still technically twinning, but you would see somewhat a 1 to 2 frame difference. And in that way, it doesn't really look too mirrored. O kaya naman, there's not really a lot of too much symmetry. We also have another way right here, wherein we do tilting. So tilting the head can kind of make it a lot more visually interesting. O kaya naman, a much more extreme thing of tilting is changing of perspective planes. So that is for the idea of twinning, and that is for acting. Next part is we have composition. So composition is essentially more on how to construct the acting that is necessary for the character. So composition actually is somewhat the middle part. Composition focuses on the abstract part that is seen in acting, yet at the same time, it is also focusing more on a technical aspect, which is like flexibility. So with this one, you can utilize it more as the scene itself. So this is something more for keyframe animators, but you can also utilize it as normal in-betweeners or even cleanup artists. So the first one that we have here is staging. So staging and our 12 principles of animation is to make sure that something is clearly and is as clear as possible. You should not mistake it for something else. If a person is happy, you need to know that that person is happy and not the other way around. You can do this with a number of things. You can do it according to the storyboarding. You can do it according to the camera movement, the angle. You can even do it on the motion that they're creating, their body language. So when it comes to staging, there is a need for you to understand the scene and at the same time the character. How would that character go about with the scene so that it could be guided with your staging? Also, for your staging, you need to be able to also see how the character moves, and the character movement is usually done through the second part, which is exaggeration. So for you to make sure that the character's movements are unmistakably clear, you need to exaggerate them a little. As I've stated kanina, when it comes to live action, it's very much possible for you to utilize very subtle imagery, very subtle movements for your character, but for animation, you can't do that. So if you want to showcase that a character is happy, you really have to showcase that the character is happy. You have to make the smile a bit wider. You have to make the eyes a bit more shining. Whereas if you want to showcase someone who's angry, you really have to furrow the eyebrows because you don't really have a lot of muscles that is around the forehead and the nose. So exaggerating your movements makes it so that it's unmistakably clear. Lastly, keeping things simple and strong. So essentially, you need to be able to make sure that, first of all, it's as strong as possible, done through the use of your exaggeration and staging, and at the same time, simple. So later on, we'll be talking about flexibility. And flexibility are essentially the ways on how you can ensure that your action is different from the other actions. But at the same time, there are a lot of different ways on how you can do flexibility that for a lot of animators, they kind of mush them in together. Ipagsasabay nila lahat-lahat to the point that it's confusing and the acting doesn't really look like the character's acting. So when it comes to making sure that your action is as flexible or it's as unique as possible, you also have to pick and choose the things that you need. Try to prevent the things that you don't really need. So for that one, make it so that it's simple. There is usually kasi a confusion when it comes to making things simple and strong. So how do I make things strong and at the same time simple? I think there is a confusion when it comes to making things that are obvious, yet at the same time making things complicated. So when you want to, if you want to keep things strong, you have to make sure that it's obvious. If you want to keep something simple, don't overcomplicate things. Don't add too much. So if you want to, like, let's say, emphasize only one thing, then you only emphasize that one thing. But it's also important for you to understand when you go overboard. So, dito na nagkakaroon ng abstract interpretation. So for some of us, the way that we interpret exaggeration might be different, and this one you can't really teach, which is over exaggeration, what is just normal caricature, which is the thing that we really need for exaggeration. So with that one, I can't really say a lot of that. Instead, it would be better for you to, again, reference other people, reference animators, and it really grows by according to your experience, which is caricature and which is over exaggeration. Again, make sure that things are obvious or your actions are obvious, yet at the same time, not complicated. And with that one, we'll be talking about flexibility. So as I've stated kanina, flexibility are more of the technical aspect. So now you have the acting and the composition down. How are you going to integrate them? I thought this really focuses more for the in-betweeners. So it really ties in nicely with our Module 6. But essentially, we have quite a number of options right here. Again, you can pick and choose what you need. You don't have to place everything right here. If you only need, like, let's say, counteraction, tas ilalagay ko lang siya sa breakdown frame, that's fine. But if you're going to add overlapping action, tas may counteraction ka pa, and in a lot of cases, those ones contradict each other, it's not really wise for you to just jumble up everything. Pick and choose what you need. First one is flexibility in terms of the breakdown frame. So the breakdown frame is essentially the frame that is between your keyframes. This is usually the first frame that you have to do in-betweening with. And as an in-betweener, you can't really mess with your keyframes. Ito, binigay siya sa inyo, you can't really change it. What you can change, however, is the breakdown frame, unless it has been created by the keyframe animators. But the breakdown frame is one of the single yet biggest changes that you can create in an animation. So just changing this one single frame can make it so that your animation is very much different from another animator. So we have here an example. A lot of the photos pala that you'll be seeing right here, and even the previous ones, came from the Animator Survival Kit by Richard Williams. So I suggest that you check out the book right there. There are a lot of other examples that he has of these ones, even the previous ones that you've seen. So the ones that I'm showing you right now are just basically snippets of what is placed in the book. So I would like you to please check that out as well. So with that one, we have two keyframes right here. Pag gagawin natin yung in-between frame or the breakdown frame, the most obvious one is this poker face thing right here. Logically speaking, in terms of in-betweening rules, regulations, guidelines, all of those things, this is technically correct. And if you were to hand this to your if you were to hand this to appropriate personnel, they would approve it. Yet at the same time, it doesn't really look that interesting. So it looks like run-of-the-mill, average change of facial expression. It's important for you to understand again the situation before you can create the proper breakdown. If let's say the situation really just calls for this, that's fine. But there are some instances wherein the situation can then affect the breakdown. So for example, let's just focus on these two main examples right here. The first breakdown has kind of like this just normal, somewhat surprised face. So with that one, this is already an extreme difference compared to the normal one. You're just changing one thing, you're just changing the mouth. Yet at the same time, you have already a big change in terms of the situation. Probably you can create a story out of this, wherein a character is receiving good news, then that he was expecting good news rather, but the character didn't really get good news. So he was surprised that he didn't really get good news. Instead of getting good news, he got bad news, and therefore he is sad right now. Next one is we have this one right here. You have the breakdown frame is a smiling face, the same face as the extreme right here. So essentially the hold time or the hold frame for this one or the exposure time is much longer, and then immediately it changes to a sadder face. So there's a quicker change compared to that one of the first two examples that we have right here, and therefore causing a lot more vitality. You can also turn this one into a lot more complicated type of expression, wherein you can probably state that the person is smiling in front of whoever he is in front of. Then the moment that he turns into this dissatisfied or even sad face. So having these different breakdowns can help create or can help enhance a lot more story frames. So that is an example of your breakdown frame. You can even apply some of the things that we'll be talking about in flexibility right here. One of them is overlap frame. So overlap frame is essentially changing parts of the breakdown frame or even parts of the animation so that it looks more visually interesting. So an example again right here is that we have our two keyframes. If you're going to place the breakdown frame right here, it should be at the very middle. That's correct, technically, but again, it's very dull, run-of-the-mill type of animation. If you just simply tilt them either backwards or forwards, you can already get entirely different scenarios. So for example, what if that character is stretching their back? You might want to make sure that the character is having their head thrown back a little. O kaya naman, for this one, you can kind of even state that the character is standing up from sitting down, and the character is probably doubting or not really confident with standing up. So you can enhance a lot more of the plot points just by animating it a little differently. Next, we have overlapping action. So overlapping action is, again, there are some instances wherein once you're changing the direction, there is a certain delay. But the main aspect really of overlapping animation is delaying certain parts of the body. So it is technically possible for you to, like, let's say in this example, from facing towards the left, it's going to face towards the center or at least slightly right. You can just have the entire character turn its entire body going all the way to this one. Technically, that's correct. However, again, it's not interesting. So to make it interesting, you pick and choose some of the parts of the body that you would like to turn first, until eventually you're able to turn the entire character. This would depend on the number of in-betweens that you have. So for example, if you have a lot more in-betweens, then you have a lot more room to play with. Whereas if you only have 3 or just a few in-betweens, then you don't really have a lot of possibilities when it comes to that one. So again, it's really dependent on what circumstances you have as an animator. We have here an example. So in the first frame, you would just simply one small thing, the foot. And then immediately after, you can then move yung torso. So moving the torso also kind of moves the legs, even though it's unintentional, because essentially it's connected by the ones that are moving right now. But the head is still towards the left side. And moving it last makes it so that essentially you have your turn done. You can do this in a lot more different ways. It's possible for you to start with the head. So una magta-turn is the head, and then the torso, and then the legs. It is also possible for you to turn first with the torso, and then the head, and then the legs, or whichever. The style of overlapping action would again depend from person to person. So for example, for people who would matter more when it comes to the facial expressions, they might probably turn their face first, or the character's face first. For dancers, I hear that they have a lot more focus on the hips. So that's one thing that they would focus on. So probably they would turn first because of their hips. Even for the twirling ballerina that we had for, I think, Module 2 for Animation 12A, one of the examples right there is a twirling ballerina. So the way that a ballerina twirls is usually through their foot, or at least the foot that they are not turning with. So that is a way for you to be able to start off with the motion first, and then afterwards continuously work around with it. And then we also have counteraction. So counteraction is essentially the idea of the secondary action moving away from the main action. Medyo different ang counteraction to overlapping action, because overlapping action is delaying different parts according to time. Whereas for this one, you're moving both your main action and your secondary action at the same time. So yun yung main difference nila. That's why I stated they are not complementary to each other. So with that one, we have an example. We have our keyframe A and keyframe B right here. From your keyframe B, you would see that the main action showcases the character moving forward, and that is the main action. So it moves towards the right. Whereas you can see here the secondary action, it moves away. So you can see right here that this movement moves towards the other side compared to that of your main action. So again, this should happen at the same time. Even in our walk cycle, so if you remember that one, personalizing a walk cycle, one of the things that we focus on is counteraction. So if your character is going from contact point to lowest point, wherein bababa yung katawan niya, you would see that some of the counteraction secondary movements, like let's say hair, hat, clothing, even body fat, would move upwards. Pag mag-highest point siya, ibig sabihin tataas yung character, the counteraction would go down. And those are just some things that you can do for counteraction. Next one is breaking joints. So ito yung medyo complicated. So let me try to explain this a little bit more. Breaking joints is essentially the idea of bending your joints one at a time or within strategic matters so that the movement of your different body parts would be very fluid. So like for example, sa may arms natin. So whenever you're creating an animation, depending on the design, you can't really have like Adventure Time level of hands wherein the hands are essentially strings or noodles, wherein it doesn't really have a certain joint. It can possibly move around as much as it can. But if you have a more realistic character, which has bones and joints and all of those things, you can't really break them. Instead, you can bend them. Bending them in more strategic places would make it so that it looks like a noodle, or your arms look like noodles. So we have here an example of an animation of something that doesn't really use breaking joints. So what happens right here is that the arm is moving ups and upwards and downwards. So technically this is something that is correct. So you don't have to move really the wrists or the elbows or whichever. But doing this one makes it so that it's very rigid. The next one, yung breaking joints natin, utilizes bending yung elbows, yung wrists, and even the fingers so that it would move a lot smoother than it should be. So for example, we have right here. The first thing that kind of breaks or bends is the elbow right here. Tapos itong elbow na to, what happens is that it also kind of moves within this within the action as well. Together with that one, you would also see the wrist slowly move. So for this one, iba yung angle ng elbow natin dito to here. Iba rin yung angle niya dito to here. Even like let's say the wrist. So let's say the wrists right here is essentially the same. Pero around here, you would see that it has bent a bit. Ito rin, it has bent an awful lot so that you would see a lot of difference. And even for the fingers, if you would need to, you can start to see it bend right here. You would see it bend a lot more right here. So bending your joints within specific instances would make it so that it's very fluid. You would also see somewhat of a change within the path of action. So yung path of action natin dito, it's a straight up semicircle. So you would really very much see the path of action. Whereas for this one, it becomes a lot more fluid. So parang nagiging almost like it's still a curved line. But if you extend this a lot more, it can even be like somewhat of an S shape if necessary. So that is really the power of breaking joints. These are the last two. So this one focuses more on the face. First one is flexibility on the face. So we've stated a while ago that utilizing your eyes is the main way on how you can express emotion. Flexibility in the face, ito naman focuses on how you can squash and stretch your face. So squashing and stretching is the principle of animation that we should be utilizing more. And for you to be able to do that, it really focuses more on the lower part. So as you can see right here, it's really more of the lower jaw that tends to squash and stretch. So the reason for that one is because if you look back to the anatomy of the face, you would see that the upper part of the head is just a skull. It's just bones. It doesn't really move. However, the lower part is an entirely different set of bones, which is just connected within your jawline. So with that one, it's much more possible for you to get away with changing the lower part of your face rather than the upper part of your face. However, it's still possible. And even for a lot of, like, let's say, over exaggeration for the eyes, you would notice that the upper part of the head right here, it doesn't really change. What changes more is the eyes. So in some cases, your eyes might even leave up until your forehead. That is because the upper part of your head doesn't really move. So with this one, if you want to add squash and stretch, concentrate it at the lower part of the face. So the mouth, the nose, and so on and so forth. Lastly, we have overlapping actions for the face. So overlapping actions for the face is very much similar to changing expressions, wherein it would be better for you to have a change in facial expressions if you're going to go about it with sections. So for example, we have a normal facial expression to a horrified facial expression. You would start off with parts of it. So the first one would be the eyes. From the eyes, you can then move on to the nose. From the nose, you can then move on to the mouth, and then lastly, the hair. Another thing that you can utilize is actually both. You can have a gradual change of intensity, yet at the same time, the intensity would be expressed more towards initial parts of the face. So for example, we have this neutral face right here, and then we have the next one. In this example, all of them kind of gradually go up, but one of them has a more obvious change of facial expression. So of course you have the eyes, the nose, but the one that changes the most is the mouth. Next one, again, gradual change. Yet at the same time, you can see that there is a more gradual change towards the nose. And then afterwards, the eyes. And then afterwards, the hair. So there is still a few changes within just one singular thing. For the eyes, gradual change towards the nose and even towards the mouth. Yet at the same time, you can see that there is always this one facial expression that has a lot more change rather than the others. So those are just overlapping actions for the face. These ones in particular is very important since what we're going to do is mouth codes o kaya naman lip syncing. And we don't really do a lot of body movements. You can still do that, but most of the time it's really more on the face. So that ends my discussion for today. May questions po ba tayo?